Now, countering myths is something I'm very fond of, and there are plenty of them when it comes to the brain, that we only use 10% of it, or that listening to Mozart makes you cleverer. But it turns out that even when faced with the evidence that we've got something wrong, that misinformation can stick, as President Obama knows only too well.
We've had every official in Hawaii, Democrat and Republican, every news outlet that has investigated this, confirm that, yes, in fact, I was born in Hawaii, August 4th, 1961, in Kapiolani Hospital.
Despite the president releasing his birth certificate, so-called birthers still don't believe he's really an American. But new research shows that once we've got an idea in mind, it's hard to get rid of. And it can happen with everything from health scares to geopolitics. Professor Stefan Lewandowski is a cognitive scientist at the University of Western Australia. He told me how he got started on this subject.
In 2003, I became fascinated by the nature of the media reports during the invasion of Iraq. It was striking how a lot of things were reported on the morning news that by the afternoon had turned out to have been false. But there were all these reports of suspected weapons manufacturing factories being found, suspicious containers that might contain weapons of mass destruction. And that never turned out to be true, and so the information was retracted, turned out to have been misinformation. But the number of such false reports was just striking, and I became interested in what effect that might have on people's memory.
Do we know why it is that cognitively misinformation is so sticky?
The first reason is that whenever you hear something, the default assumption you're making is that it is true. That is, you expect people to tell the truth. You know, you grow up with parents who basically tell you the truth. So anything you hear, therefore, has an advantage to begin with. The second reason is more subtle and cognitively more interesting. And that is that in order for you to recognize something as being false, you in a sense have to believe it first, even if only for a brief moment. And then you have to attach a tag to it or something that identifies the information as being false. And that turns out to require a lot of attention and a lot of cognitive effort. It's not something that happens automatically. So if I tell you the moon is made of green cheese, you can probably identify that as being false. However, that takes a little bit of effort. And if you're distracted or you're not paying attention, then it might just slip in.
So in experiments, if you tell people some information and then tell them it's not true and then ask them questions about it, some of them will still go back to this original information.
Indeed. And what's striking about that is that if you ask people whether something has been corrected, they'll tell you. They'll say, oh, yeah, I know. You told me that is false. But then if a second later you ask them a question that requires them to make an inference, they have to make some sort of judgment of why something happened, then you can show that people still rely on that misinformation. Let me illustrate that with an example. Suppose I tell you about this fictitious warehouse fire, and then early on that somebody found evidence that there were oil paints and flammable materials inside a wiring cabinet, suggesting that the fire might have been caused by negligence. Now, if I then later on tell you that, in fact, this was incorrect, that was a false message, the wiring cabinet was empty, then what happens is that people can actually tell me that they were told that the wiring cabinet was empty. But if I then ask them an inference question, so I say, okay, can you guess or can you tell me why there might have been so much smoke coming from the fire? Then what participants often will do is to say, oh, yeah, well, that's because the oil paint in the wiring cabinet creates a lot of smoke when it's burning.
So it's almost as though we fail to erase properly that earlier information when it was wrong. We kind of don't delete it.
Precisely. And there's a good reason for that. And that is that if you just deleted that information, then it would leave you with a hole in your mental model of the narrative. And people find that very unsatisfying. So they would rather have a complete mental model that's incorrect rather than one that's correct but incomplete.
Do we know why it is that trying to refute myths can actually backfire and make people believe them more strongly than they ever did?
The problem is this. If I try to retract a myth by mentioning it, which people often try to do, they say it's a myth that you can get AIDS from a toilet seat, let's say. The fact is, no, you can't. Well, the problem is that then you're actually repeating the myth, and the mere repetition of that information is enough to make it more familiar and more accessible in your memory.
So if we were all more sceptical in the first place about everything we heard, then would that begin to solve the problem?
It might, provided you are not dismissing absolutely everything you hear. You've got to strike a balance between cynicism and rejection of absolutely everything, and healthy skepticism, which is to evaluate the likelihood that something might be true or false. But absolutely, if you practice skepticism well, then chances are you're going to differentiate between things that are true and other things that are false.
Stefan Lewandowski.